Hey, I didn't say that. You're trying to confuse me. This is a trap. In a heartbreaking turn of events, a 13-year-old boy finds himself at the center of a media storm after being accused of murdering a classmate. As tensions mount, his family, his therapist, and the lead detective are drawn into a labyrinth of emotions and secrets, questioning what really happened behind this tragic event. It all begins with two detectives, Luke and Frank, who head to a family's home accompanied by their team. At 6 a.m. they abruptly burst into the Miller home. The family, shocked and bewildered, does not understand what is happening. Without resistance, they obey the officer's orders. Detective Luke informs them that he has a warrant to search the home and asks for Jamie. Upon finding the young man, the detective informs him that he is under arrest on suspicion of murder. Pointing their weapons at him, they immediately order him to raise his hands. Jamie, completely scared, even goes so far as to wet his pants, prompting the officers to ask his father to come upstairs to help him change his clothes. Meanwhile, officers are thoroughly searching every corner of the house, including the parents' dirty clothes, for any evidence that could be related to the crime, including the murder weapon. The parents, extremely confused by the situation, ask the officers what is happening. However, they are told that they should not get involved in the matter while they take Jay to a nearby police station. The Millers try to prevent the arrest, arguing that their son would not be capable of committing such a serious act. However, their protests are dismissed. Eddie, Jay's father, advises the young man to keep quiet until he has spoken to a lawyer, assuring him that everything will be resolved. However, as he is being transported, Jamie tearfully continues to insist on his innocence, pleading to be believed. Detective Luke suggests that he remain silent, warning him that anything he says can be used against him. In addition, he introduces her to her responsible adult, who has been temporarily assigned to her custody. Upon arriving at the police station, the sergeant approaches Jay and asks if he would like a lawyer. The young man answers affirmatively. The sergeant then asks if he already has a lawyer or if he prefers the station to provide one for him. Jay, not having legal representation, agrees to let the station assign him a lawyer. He is then informed that, as a minor, he must be accompanied by a responsible adult and is asked if he prefers it to be one of his parents. Jamie expresses his preference for his father to accompany him. The sergeant continues with the questions and asks if he takes any medication. Jamie answers no. He then asks him if he suffers from any conditions such as allergies or asthma, to which the young man also responds negatively. Later, his emotional state is investigated by asking him if he has attempted suicide. Again, Jamie answers no. He is finally informed that he will be detained while officers present evidence against him and that he will remain at the station for 24 hours. He is then led to the cell where he will remain until his admission process is completed and his first official interrogation is scheduled. Meanwhile, Detective Luke meets with Jay's parents to provide them with details about the case. He explains that Jamie has requested a lawyer and asks if they have any they trust. Eddie replies no, so the detective informs him that the station will assign him one. At this point, Eddie asks if the appointed lawyer will be one of them, to which Detective Luke clarifies that said lawyer does not work for them. His duty is to protect Jay's interests. Eddie expresses his distrust by suggesting that if the lawyer is free, he probably won't be of good quality. However, Luke assures them that they are very competent lawyers, which leads Jamie's parents to accept the proposal. Jay's mother, Manda, turns to Luke and asks how they can treat them this way after what happened at their home. The detective replies that they have the option of filing a formal complaint. He then informs Eddie that Jamie must have a responsible adult by his side during the process and mentions that the young man has requested that his father accompany him. He or she will be present during the interrogation, as well as during blood tests and other related procedures. The detective asks if Eddie agrees with his feelings. Luke also clarifies an important point. If Jamie has confided in him any information about the crime, he won't be able to accompany him. Eddie firmly responds that Jamie hasn't revealed anything to him and reaffirms that his son has done nothing wrong. Eddie then asks Amanda not to share what's happening with anyone, as they don't have any clear information yet. However, she replies that she is only writing to the neighbor to make sure the house is in good condition, since they no longer have a door. In a conversation with Detective Frank, Luke asks if she's worried about Jamie's father. She answers no and asks him why. Luke tells him that in a previous case he had to deal with a young man whose father was involved in some very serious situations and that it took them months to realize what was really happening to him. However, Frank assures him that he does not consider this to be the same case. Jay is then taken to a room where a nurse assesses his condition. Left alone with her father, Jamie breaks down in tears again and asks if Eddie really believes her. Trying to stay calm, she answers affirmatively and encourages him to eat something, assuring him that everything will be okay. Shortly after, lawyer Paul appears, who will take charge of Jamie's defense. Paul introduces himself to the young man's parents and explains that the officers will provide them with all relevant information about the case. He also informs Eddie that as a responsible adult, his role will be to ensure that Jamie remains calm throughout the process. Paul meets with the detectives, who provide only basic details, reserving the most important questions for the official interrogation. With this information, the lawyer heads to the medical examination, which Eddie will also attend. Jamie is photographed and subjected to various medical tests. A swab is performed and fingerprints are taken. However, when they ask him for a blood sample, the young man flatly refuses as he suffers from a phobia of needles. The officers explain to him that he has no choice and that he must do so, since refusing could jeopardize his defense. Finally, Jay agrees. Just when Jay thinks the whole process is over, he realizes he's wrong when he's notified that he must submit to a body search. Eddie tries to object, but the lawyer clarifies that this is a mandatory procedure in cases of serious crimes. They need to make sure he has no hidden wounds or objects hidden. Seeing the concern on her father's face, Jay decides to cooperate. However, Eddie is deeply uncomfortable seeing everything his son has to deal with. Jay tells him not to worry, that everything will pass quickly and that she doesn't want to see him angry about this situation. Despite this, Eddie accepts the situation, although his discomfort is evident. Paul meets again with Jamie and Eddie before the interrogation. With an understanding attitude, Paul tells Jamie that he has handled the situation admirably. He then asks her what her favorite subject is. Jamie, somewhat surprised by the question, questions the relevance of the topic, but Paul insists that he share his answer. Finally, Jamie reveals that his favorite subject is history. Intrigued, Paul asks him why he feels this way, and the young man replies that he enjoys stories. Paul continues to ask what his favorite part of history is, to which Jamie replies that it's the Industrial Revolution. After hearing a brief explanation of his interest, the lawyer comments that he is a very intelligent boy, then clarifies that he is not there to question him about whether he committed the crime or not. Their main goal is to protect you no matter what has happened. However, he mentions that the police consider him guilty and explains that when they begin to question him about the events of the previous night, he should answer without comment. To make sure Jamie understands this instruction, Paul practices with him using some mock questions, teaching him to distinguish which ones he should answer and which ones he shouldn't. He also makes it clear that if he ever feels doubtful or nervous, both he and his father will be there to provide unconditional support. When they are finally alone before the interrogation, Eddie, in a serious yet concerned voice, asks his son to tell him the truth, imploring him not to lie and that if he really did do something wrong, this is the time to confess. However, Jay firmly reaffirms that he did not commit any crime. Finally, they are called and both enter the interrogation room. Everything will be recorded to be used as evidence. At trial, detectives begin by asking basic questions such as where you were and what you did the night before. As advised by his lawyer, Jay answers most questions without comment. Suddenly, Luke places a file full of screenshots on the table. These are comments Jamie made on his social media account directed at several models, where you can read various phrases with negative content toward women. Jamie reacts in surprise and denies feeling any rejection towards them. Luke then asks her about her close friends, the ones she often appears with in her Instagram photos. Jay to answer. His father tells him not to be afraid and to tell the truth. Finally, he mentions his friends, although he avoids clarifying whether he was with them the night before. Now the detectives show him a photograph of Katie, a classmate, and ask him what relationship he had with her. He answers that they were not friends. However, Detective Frank informs him that she frequently commented on his Instagram posts, suggesting they were likely friends. Jay admits that maybe they were and she asks if he thinks other people would describe them that way. At that moment, Jay responds with a question if it was really her who died last night. Luke confirms that he did and the detectives suspect that he already knew. It's clever of you to ask that kind of question. Luke places a forensic report on the table explaining that the young woman was found murdered in a parking lot, stabbed 7 times in different parts of her body. The atmosphere in the room becomes more tense. Jamie tells them that he has nothing to do with what happened. However, the detectives show him security camera footage from that night, in which Jay can be seen following Katie at a distance. Eddie looks at his son with concern and asks him to explain why he was chasing her. Jay denies following her, insisting she had no problem with Katie. However, the detectives distrust his story and decide to show him the definitive proof, a security camera video clearly showing the crime. In the video, Jay is seen attacking Katie. Jamie starts to shake and doesn't know what to say anymore. Tears flow from their eyes, but they don't utter a single word. Luke asks if she has anything to say to them, but Jay remains silent. The interview concludes and both Jay and Eddie cry in the interrogation room. 3 days later, detectives Luke and Frank meet outside Katie's school to gather more information and try to locate the murder weapon. Before beginning his investigative work, Luke sends his son Adam a voice note informing him that he will be at his school conducting investigations and promising not to bother him. Elsewhere we see Ryan and Tommy, two of Jamie's friends. Ryan tells Tommy that the police are at the school, which is not a good sign. He then asks if he has any news about Jamie. Tommy replies that they probably don't allow him to have his phone, which is why he can't answer. Ryan, concerned, asks if she believes it's true that Jamie was responsible. Tommy nods and expresses that he doesn't want to get involved in trouble, to which Ryan replies that he doesn't want Jamie to get involved in it either. However, Tommy replies that he is already in the middle of complications. As Luke and Frank walk through the halls of the school, they notice many students nervously watching them, whispering to each other, creating a tense and uneasy atmosphere. Next we see Adam, who is listening to the voice note his father sent him. At that moment he realizes that they are putting garbage in his food and a friend threatens him, demanding money. However, a teacher intervenes and calls the aggressor's attention. Elsewhere, the detectives decide to talk to Jade, Katie's best friend. Detective Luke informs him that they have arrested Jamie, but that they need to gather more information about both the murder weapon they haven't found yet, and the reasons behind the suspect's actions. Jaden replies that all they need to know is that Tai is dead and that she was the best person he knew. When Frank asks what Taty's relationship with the boys was like, Jade clarifies that if he's referring to Jamie, she didn't get close to him. Frank asks if that means they didn't get along. However, she mentions that they have Instagram posts where Katie interacted with Jay, which suggests a friendship between them. Jade gets defensive, asking if they're trying to blame her. He also mentions that everyone knows a video related to the case. Before the detectives can ask another question, Jade gets irritated and decides to leave. Without having managed to obtain much information, Luke and Frank continue their tour of the school and enter Jamie's classroom, where they encounter a noticeably indifferent atmosphere. Some students laugh and make jokes without showing the slightest concern for what happened. Faced with this situation, Luke decides to speak up and addresses them directly, stating that if any of them have relevant information about what happened, this is the right time to talk. However, the students remain silent, no one responds. Therefore, Luke leaves his contact number with Professor Malik, telling them they can contact him anonymously if they remember anything important. After not getting many answers, Luke talks to Frank and expresses his confusion regarding Jade's anger, who implied that Katie despised Jamie. The detectives continue their search for clues, and Luke suggests to Frank that they should identify any boys exhibiting strange behavior for questioning. Then Luke and Frank enter another classroom. At that moment, the teacher mentions that Luke is Adam's father, which causes some students to mock him. Faced with this situation, Luke reminds them that a terrible crime had recently been committed in the city. However, the conversation is suddenly interrupted by the fire alarm, prompting everyone to rush out to the school courtyard. Once in the yard, Jade begins to hit Ryan, hitting him multiple times in a state of obvious annoyance. The teachers quickly intervene to remove her and control the situation, while Ryan is taken to the infirmary for treatment. Luke and Frank head to where Ryan is, and when they get there they decide to interrogate him directly. Luke stares at him and gets to the point. He tells him that they know he and Jamie were together the night of the crime and asks him what really happened. Ryan lowers his head and replies that he doesn't know. They just hung out. At this, Luke asks where the gun Jay used is. Ryan becomes visibly nervous and denies having any information about it. Then he quickly gets up and leaves the place. Then Luke's son, Adam, approaches his father and tells him that he had mentioned his desire to talk to someone who could help him understand the situation, so he decided to approach him. Luke asks if anyone has provided him with information or if he has any information on the whereabouts of the murder weapon. Adam replies that things are not going well, as he cannot understand anything that is happening. He doesn't grasp the magnitude of the situation. Adam then asks Luke if he's been checking Instagram. Luke confirms that he does, and then Adam shows him a comment written by Key. He points out that although his comment seems kind on the surface, it really isn't. He asks him to notice the reference to dynamite, which is an explosive red pill. He explains that the term incel is used to mock people who have difficulty forming romantic or sexual relationships. Adam also explains the meaning of certain emojis. If you send a red heart, it means love. A purple one indicates sexual desire. Yellow expresses interest in the person. Pink indicates interest but not necessarily of a sexual nature. And orange suggests that the person is fine. As he takes in all this information, Luke begins to realize something crucial. Jamie was a victim of bullying. Luke informs Frank that they've made a serious mistake regarding the Instagram situation. In fact, Kiri was stalking Jamie and those were the messages they exchanged in which she called him incel. Faced with this revelation, Luke decides to question Ryan again, as he suspects there is something more hidden behind this matter. However, when they go to look for him in the classroom, Ryan jumps out the window and escapes. Luke begins an intense chase running through the schoolyard. He finally manages to catch up with him and stops him. She determinedly asks Ryan to tell her the truth and asks him if he gave the gun to Jamie. For a few seconds, Ryan remains silent, but then confesses that the gun was his. However, he claims not to know where he is and says he didn't want Jamie to get involved in such a situation. With this confession, detectives proceed to arrest Ryan for conspiracy to commit homicide. After this event, Luke suggests to his son that they go out to eat together. During this outing they have a conversation that significantly contributes to improving their relationship. Elsewhere, Eddie heads to the spot where Katie was murdered, experiencing deep grief at finding himself at the crime scene. 7 months later, Jamie remains detained in a juvenile psychiatric facility, and his trial is about to begin. Psychologist Bryony has been assessing Jamie's mental state and tells the security guard that she heard about a violent incident involving Jamie. He requests to see the recording of the incident and the guard agrees to show it to him. Bryony watches as Jamie hits another boy. Later the psychologist has her 5th session with Jay. In a kind gesture, he brings her hot chocolate with marshmallows and tells her he's also set aside half of his sandwich because he's hungry. During the conversation they mention their grandparents. The psychologist asks him what his father's parents are like, to which Jamie replies that they are like him. They like to do things their own way. Next, Brian asks if he sees much of his dad in his grandfather. Jay nods affirmatively. The psychologist then asks whether this similarity is due to what they say or how they act. And he is also interested in the characteristics of both men, his father and his grandfather. Jamie simply replies that they are men. The psychologist comments that when she hears that word she imagines they like sports, bars and fixing things. Jamie confirms that this is indeed the case, although he clarifies that the tavern thing doesn't apply. He then shares more about his life, recalling a time he went on holiday to Tenerife. However, Jay's attitude suddenly changes and he expresses frustration at the stupid questions he thinks she's asking about masculinity. He also mentions that he feels Bryony is trying to trick him, emphasizing that his father is a good person. The psychologist assures him that she knows, but Jamie insists that she's talking about him unnecessarily. Bryony replies that it's fine if that's her perception, but she really has no intention of deceiving him. Jay tells her that she works for them, but she clarifies that she doesn't. Their job is to prepare an independent report on pre-sentencing offenses, which the judge will read to better understand the charges against them. She believes that both he and all people are extremely complex and that direct questions are not enough to capture that complexity. In an attempt to dig deeper, he asks what he thinks of his mother and sister as well as what his mother thinks of him. Jay, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, is reluctant to answer, so she inquires about the fight they had earlier. The young man explains that another boy hit him and when asked why that happened, Jamie replies that they just don't get along, adding that it wasn't a real fight. The psychologist takes the opportunity to ask him if he doesn't find this situation interesting, to which he responds with a resounding no. She then asks about his experience as a man and asks how he feels about it. Jay admits that he doesn't know. Given this response, she clarifies that for this reason she will ask other questions such as, "What do you think of your father and your grandfather?" Instead of questioning him about his male identity, she asks him if he enjoys his job. Jay mentions that her father fixes toilets and works long hours. He mentions that emergencies are the most rewarding. The psychologist asks him if he considers his father a funny person, to which Jamie occasionally answers affirmatively. Then asks if he is affectionate. The young man replies that he rarely shows that kind of affection. Bryony then asks if her father has a short temper, and Jay admits that he can be. The psychologist is interested in knowing if you get angry frequently. However, Jamie defends his father, saying that he has never hit him and that he reacts angrily like anyone else. She assures him that this is normal and represents a level of anger acceptable. However, Jamie decides to retract part of what he said and confesses to having knocked down a shed in a moment of rage. He clarifies that this was the most serious incident. Bryony asks him if that scared him. He responds negatively, pointing out that at the time he found it funny, and so did his sister. He remembers how his mother told them to go inside the house and emphasizes that his father doesn't usually react like that. Jay wants to understand if her father is being evaluated in this process, but Bree explains that she only seeks to understand the importance of her father figure in her life, given that she chose him as a responsible adult during the development of the case. Jay confesses that he chose his father because he never judges him and is always very kind to him. The conversation shifts to the topic of sports, and Jamie recalls how his father used to take him to football games. However, when he made mistakes during the game, his father tended to avoid looking at him. He speculates whether this might be due to a mixture of grief or shame. Finally, the psychologist asks what other activities he was good at, but he replies disdainfully that he didn't care about being good at those things. Jamie asks Brian if he thinks it's right that he was put in a mental asylum instead of a regular prison. She explains that the training center is the safest place for him, since reformatories are intended for youth over the age of 15. However, Jamie is deeply frustrated by his situation, especially knowing that Ryan is at home awaiting trial. Brian clarifies that Ryan is not being accused of a serious crime like he is. As the conversation progresses, Jay begins to get agitated. Tension builds up inside him until he suddenly explodes emotionally. He raises his voice and demands to be allowed to return home, shouting that he is only accused, but that he has not committed any offense. The psychologist, in a calm tone, asks her to sit down. However, this request provokes an even more intense reaction from Jamie. He completely loses control, becoming enraged and hitting the furniture. Faced with this overwhelming situation, the psychologist decides to take a break and go outside for some fresh air, hoping the teenager will calm down. When Bryony returns to the room, she regains control of the situation and addresses Jay more firmly. He explains that he is not there to force him to admit his guilt, but to try to understand what happened and how he got to that point. Jay, now calmer and embarrassed by his previous reaction, promises to behave better and apologizes for raising his voice. As the conversation progresses, the young man confesses that he once saw an intimate photograph of Key, which had been shared at school by other students. However, he insists that he has never had romantic feelings towards her. After a brief, tense pause, Jay explodes emotionally again, hurling insults filled with pent-up rage. When the psychologist asks him about the comments Katie had left on his social media, Jay explains that the young woman used to refer to him with contempt, using humiliating nicknames. He believes she ridiculed him because of his physical appearance and claims that her words made him feel inferior and unattractive. He remembers once trying to confront her, but she just smiled mockingly and responded with a simple okay. Amy mentions that the whole chain of insults and cruel comments started when he decided to ask her out of empathy for her. Because everyone at school had seen her intimate photo, Kay scornfully rejected it, and from that moment on, a wave of Instagram mockery erupted, much of it public and supported by her classmates through reactions and comments. At the end of her story, Jay clarifies that she never intended to hurt Katie. He stresses that his purpose was not to seek revenge and that he does not consider himself a bad person. He also mentions that the videos where he appears attacking her are fake, although he admits that he must have done it because she was scared and he had a knife. However, he chose not to do so, considering himself better than many others who would have touched his body. The psychologist asks him if he understands the concept of death and if he understands that Katie will not return. Jamie replies that he hasn't, but she wants to know if he understands that murder is a crime for which he will be arrested if convicted, to which Jamie replies that he is already aware of that. The psychologist concludes the session and recommends that she accept any psychological or emotional help she may receive regardless of the outcome of the trial. Jay becomes considerably angry and begins to scream in despair as he is led out of the room. As he is being led away, he asks the psychologist if she really cares for him, begging her not to tell the judge and asking her to tell his father that he will be fine. 13 months after the events, sentencing has still not been handed down, and the Miller family is struggling to lead a normal life. Today is Eddie's birthday and Manda is busy preparing his favorite breakfast. However, before you enjoy it, she suggests you check your birthday cards. Her mood changes when she discovers a handmade card Jay sent her. At that very moment, Lisa interrupts to inform them that the work truck has been painted, but none of the neighbors have seen who did it. Faced with this situation, Eddie asks Amanda to call the police while he looks for the necessary materials to clean the paint. The man then informs the authorities about the content of the messages written on the van, but they decide not to wait for the officers to arrive, as they want to quickly remove what has been painted. Manda feels exhausted by the situation, but Eddie assures her that they won't have that conversation again. However, she reminds him that the trial will take place in 4 weeks and that everyone will be present. Eddie, for his part, claims that they will protect Jay from everything. At this point, Manda suggests moving out, which angers Eddie. He doesn't want to change his life because of what happened and believes that moving will only make things worse, since they haven't done anything wrong. His frustration begins to boil over. At that moment, Eddie realizes that Lisa is listening to them and tells her not to worry. Later, while cleaning the van, a group of teenagers walk by laughing at the graffiti. In an impulsive fit, Eddie decides to follow them, grabs one of them and gives him a verbal lesson before throwing his bike at him. His wife and daughter try to calm him down, but he is out of his mind. He opens the painting he bought and angrily throws it at the truck, thus covering up the insult. The store security guard watches him and demands that he clean up the mess. However, Eddie refuses and leaves hastily with his family, who are fearful of his behavior. In the car they receive a call from the detention center. It's Jamie who calls to wish her father a happy birthday, but also to inform him that she has decided to plead guilty. The news leaves Eddie completely speechless. His wife and daughter try to change the subject and greet him, but Jamie remains distant. Before hanging up, she tells her father she's sorry, and after finishing the call, the parents are plunged into a deep silence at home. Manda tells Eddie that she's noticed an improvement in Jamie, perhaps because he's made an important decision. However, Eddie remains silent, absorbed in his thoughts. Manda also points out that he was with Jamie, while she hasn't even had the chance to see the video of what happened. Eddie asks him not to repeat that conversation again. Manda then tells him that she understands he's angry, but she thinks it's better for Jay to plead guilty. Eddie replies that he does not want to accept that reality. Manda insists that they must find a way out of this difficult situation. In a moment of reflection, she recalls how Jay isolated herself and avoided communicating with them. Eddie, for his part, tells him that there's nothing they can do about it, since teenagers tend to behave that way and they can't watch them all the time. Eddie questions whether he has truly been a good father and confesses that he has always tried to break away from the bad example he received during his childhood. Even though Jamie wasn't particularly good at sports, Eddie always did his best to support him in any way he could. She thought that by being in his room, Jay was safe and out of danger, but sadly she realizes that wasn't the case and feels guilty for not having paid more attention.